Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, 10 Steps to Building an Effective Vulnerability Management Program with cybersecurity expert Derek A. Smith. You're also joined by BeyondTrust Retina Product Manager Alex DaCosta, who will run through a brief demo of BeyondTrust Retina Enterprise Vulnerability Management Solution towards the end of the webinar, so be sure to stick around for that. My name is Sarah and I'm your host today. And so before we dive into the webcast, I just wanted to touch on a few housekeeping items. First thing, all attendee lines are muted. However, in an effort to keep this interactive, I encourage you to ask your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console. We will try to cover your questions at the end of the webinar during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and as attendees, you will all receive the link to the recording via an email later this week. So at this point, I'd like to turn the phone over to Derek. Derek, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and please take it away.
All right, thank you very much for having me once again. Thank everybody for being here. Again, my name is Derek Smith. I've had the pleasure of working on vulnerability management programs for places like Booz Allen and Computer Sciences Corporation, the Army Research Laboratory, and other government agencies and companies as well. Also, I've been teaching for about 20 years now as an adjunct professor for various colleges and universities, and also for private programs for certification and training and things like that. And I've been around security for over 30 years now. I've done physical security. I've been a federal agent for various law enforcement agencies for over 18 years. And of course, as a civilian, I do security, IT security. I run a security program for a large company right now. I'm also a fellow at Excelsior College and an adjunct professor there, and at University of Maryland, Baltimore College as well. So I've been around this stuff for a while, and I want to kind of share some of the best practices and the things I've learned in order to get you to where you're trying to be. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the problem here. We're going to start off looking at what the problem is when it comes to vulnerability management programs and how companies are dealing with that particular problem. Next slide. So first, there are major issues, and companies are basically feeling the pain here. Here's what they have. Number one, they have to figure out how they can isolate the problem. Companies have to figure out what causes the actual damage. As you see here, I have 95% of breaches target known vulnerabilities. So if we know that, how come it's so hard for us to deal with these problems, deal with these situations? We have to know what's causing that damage, and then, of course, the problem shouldn't be any surprise to us. Number two problem we have, or thing we have to deal with, is how do we stop the damage? How do we prevent it from happening? What's our options? We have to look at our risks. I'll tell you this, a lot of people and a lot of programs are compliance-driven when they should be risk-driven. So we're going to talk about risk. And basically, risk equals your assets plus, times your vulnerabilities times those threats. And we can control those vulnerabilities. But we're going to have to figure out how to do that. Number three, we have to look at how do we successfully deal with the vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are doubling every year, if not more than that. They're becoming more complex. Our resources are down. People are starting to cut costs. And another thing, we throw a lot of technology at the problem. But it's not just a technology issue, as we'll see. It's also a human resources issue as well. And the fourth thing is, how do we make the best security decisions based on what we know, based on the risk and the risk platform? How do we make the choices on what to fix or deal with as far as the vulnerabilities are concerned? Make sure that do we need more data? Do we need more information to make decisions? We're going to talk about those various things. Next slide. But first we have to have a basis. We have to know what vulnerability management is. Next slide, please. And vulnerability management is basically this. It's a process that we use to determine whether to eliminate, mitigate, or tolerate vulnerabilities. So again, it sounds familiar, doesn't it? It sounds like risk. Do we eliminate, do we mitigate, or do we tolerate those vulnerabilities based upon that risk and the cost that we have to outlay for fixing the vulnerability itself? Next slide. It's made up of these components at a high level. But basically, as I said before, it's our process that we use to determine to eliminate, mitigate, or tolerate risk. So we have to balance our demands of security versus demands of our business, our business value drivers. Remember, when it comes to security and everything we do, it's about how do we become a business enabler, and that's what we want to look at here. So, as I said, it's an intelligent confluence of the assessments, what assets are we talking about protecting, which we'll talk about soon, plus an analysis of what should we fix first, where does the money need to go first, and then how do we fix that problem, our remediation steps. Okay? This is a component, vulnerability management is a component of risk management in itself. And again, we want to balance those demands of the goals and the business processes. Next slide. And next slide. So what we have to do now is that we have to look at the challenges that we have for vulnerability management. And there are a few, and I'm going to get to the slides in just a second, but we all know that for all of us on this webinar and for everyone, or every organization in general, that information is a valuable asset, and it's our job as security professionals to secure it, and that's a challenge. So as the value of this information increases, so does the attractiveness of that information to the bad guys, to the criminals, to the attackers that start to get into our systems. But unlike our other valuable assets like cash and things like that, information is not secured in a large safe somewhere. We can just lock it away and we can know that we're safe. And it's not easy to protect it. So instead, we have to look at where it is, and we know the information is spread across many different areas, many different systems, many networks, many devices. Heck, it might even be in our partners' hands. We have to understand and wonder what our partners are doing with it. Or nowadays, it may be in the cloud. And how do we mitigate the issues dealing with the cloud, especially if we have a private cloud? Now we look at our adversaries, and they're attempting to steal our information range. Their attempts at stealing it range from things like traditional hacking techniques, where they look to compromise our system, to online activists looking to promote their causes, to criminals trying to monetize the data and systems that we have in our organization. So those tools and techniques that they employ range in a variety of different types of sophistication. They rely on the weaknesses or those vulnerabilities that we're speaking about today that they find in our systems, like missing patches, poor password, poor processes that we have in place, bad system configuration and things like that. So given the change and given the rate of change that we deal with in our organizations on a daily basis, and the range of different types of software that we deploy and hardware and everything else, the odds are heavy in the favor of the bad guys actually finding our vulnerabilities. I always said this throughout my years in law enforcement. We're always reactive, and they have plenty of time to be proactive. So the traditional approach that most of us take, like vulnerability scanning, to scan systems for the application weakness, systems and applications for weaknesses and things like that, don't always work. We have to have some other things that we can do. Okay? Especially when we look at the intervals and when people do this. Sometimes it's quarterly, sometimes it's monthly, and you do all these scans. I used to have my team do these scans at the Army Research Lab. We get so much data, and then when do you have the time to actually go through this data? When do you have the time to actually look at it and understand what's happening? And another problem I have is that a lot of my technicians, a lot of my analysts didn't understand what they were seeing. They just run a Nessus scan and say, okay, or whatever scan it may be, okay, here's the raw data. I'm like, no, you have to go back. You have to interpret that data based on the person's systems, and then you have to make some sense out of that data. So we're going to go through and we're going to do that. Now, a challenge I have on the slide is assessment, as I was just saying. I was saying that the traditional scanners cannot handle large networks, or well, I'll say, well, I didn't say they can't handle large networks, but they can't. They give you a large bunch of information. But also, they can't handle large networks. They produce volumes of useless checks that sometimes we don't interpret it and we don't know how to use them and what they're good for. I mean, they may not be good for anything. Garbage in, garbage out is what I call it. Okay? They're time-consuming. As I said before, they're resource-intensive. They have to put a lot of people on it, and they have to spend a lot of time, if they have the time, looking at it. And then, of course, finding the problem itself is only half the battle. Next slide. Another challenge we have is analysis. As I told you before, some of my people didn't understand what they were seeing. So manual and resource-intensive process to determine what we need to fix, if we even should fix it, and when we should fix it. When do we throw money at it? There's no correlation between the vulnerabilities and the threats and assets. We run a scan, we get these things, but where's the business process? Where's the business correlation between these things? No way to prioritize what vulnerabilities should be addressed and in what order. The data is stale sometimes. We're making decisions on last quarter's vulnerabilities because we just got around to taking the time to look at it. And what I see in many, many organizations is no credible metrics. We have metrics in place sometimes, counting how many this and how many that, but do they really make any sense? How do we correlate those metrics and make those metrics make sense? Next slide. And then we have to have the challenge of remediation. So security resources are often decentralized. Security organization often doesn't own the network or system. Even if we own the network, it says, well, we'll say this. We know that most of the time in security we don't own the system. And it's difficult oftentimes to work with other people in order to try to make things happen in your system. And then, you know, they have to shut things down. They have to put it into their maintenance schedule. They have to go to change control boards. All these things have to happen if they can happen. And then they see us oftentimes as security as a nuisance to them. Multiple groups may own the assets, as I spoke about. We have to coordinate our efforts. And presenting useful, meaningful information to relevant stakeholders. We have to get buy-in from the stakeholders to make them understand the concerns, the security concerns that we have, and the fixes or the remediation that has to take place. And then we have to go back and make sure they actually did it. Did they actually make the fix that we recommended? And again, remember, a lot of times we're just recommending. Now, some of them will be mandatory. We can make them mandatory depending on your organization, but oftentimes, you know, it's not. Okay, it's just a recommendation. Next slide, please. And another factor is time. I just put this up there to show the time, because we have a vulnerability that's discovered, you know, and then we have to have time to fix it. You know, have to have time to find it. You have to hear that some vulnerabilities have been on systems for many, many months or many, many years, especially a lot of them that's coming up recently. So what's the time factor involved? Next slide. Before I move on, you have to identify several key weaknesses in your vulnerability management system. Now, I'm going to get to that before I move into the vulnerability management lifecycle. But there are a number of areas that expose systems to harm, and these areas are things like your software. You know, all software, as we know it, have inherent bugs in them. So some of these bugs may never be discovered at all, and the software may continue to function perfectly. But sometimes there are going to be bugs that's going to cause problems for your system. So we have to figure out what these bugs are, because they can lead to security weaknesses. We have implementation and configuration concerns. We have change control concerns. If we change something based on our vulnerability scan, it's going to bring down our system. And we have the human element, of course. A key element often overlooked in securing a network is this element of us, the human element. Most people simply see the computers, the applications, the network they use as tools to help them do their job. However, if they're not properly trained, as I was telling my analysts were not in some cases, to do their job, then we have a problem. Okay? They could actually expose our systems to more security threats by trying to go in and do something that they're not qualified to do. Okay? So next slide. Let's look at our vulnerability management life cycle. And it has the 9 pieces. And I'm not going to cover all the pieces today in the time that we have. However, we have our policies. Everything we do should be driven by our policies. And we have to make sure those things are established. I work in IT governance now, and my job is to establish these policies and then make sure people have the training to do what it is they're supposed to do. We have to have them in place. I'm going to talk about this more in a few minutes, but we have to know what it is that we're trying to protect. We have to have an inventory. We have to discover all the assets across the network, know what we're dealing with, and then we can put the right vulnerability management solution in place. We have to prioritize, as I said, what do we fix first? We do this by assigning business value to the assets, and then we know what we can put in place. Okay? Next, we look at our vulnerabilities. We determine our vulnerabilities and our assets through our inventory, of course. We look at our threats. We view our potential threats, and we weigh those threats as to what will they really have an effect on us. We look at our risk level. We look at remediation. How do we proactively fix those vulnerabilities before we actually have a problem? We look at our metrics, how we're going to measure impact. And remember, measurement and metrics is 2 different things. Measurement is just that, taking measurements, getting numbers. We have metrics when we take a variety of measures together and actually do something with those measures, actually look at a trend and see what it is that's happening. Then we have true metrics. And then, of course, we have our compliance issues. Next slide, please. So now, in order to deal with these challenges that I just described to you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a 10-step approach that you can use to implement an effective vulnerability management program in your organization. So hopefully today you will take at least something away with you that you can use. Step one is identify all the assets. I told you you can't do anything before you identify the assets. So first, to ensure that that you can proactively detect, remember I said proactively detect and respond to security threats, you need to implement a comprehensive vulnerability management program that's integrated with other disciplines within your organization. We'll get into that a little as we go on. So that what this is going to do for you is it's going to allow vulnerability to be detected early so that other processes, such as your patch management program, can be used to protect the organization from a potential breach, again, proactively. So these 10 steps are going to help you. First, as I said, you identify all the assets you need. So you identify your assets through things like your network assets, your network devices, operating systems, your applications, what versions you have, and so on. But in order to secure something, as I said before, it's important to first know that it exists, what it is, and where it's located. And you do that by identifying these assets I have here. Now, a crucial first step you have to remember in securing a network is to identify all those assets on the network. And then they should be included in every element that makes up your computing environment, such as your routers, your switches, your servers, your firewall, your print operating system, system software, and it goes on and on, your application software as I have identified here. Now the relationship and the dependencies that you have between these various assets need to also be identified and recorded somewhere. You need to have a good asset inventory management system. I talked about recording it, so recording the relationship and the dependency between these assets is going to give you the ability to make it possible for you to determine the path that an attacker might take. So you see the importance of that. So you have to record the relationship dependency so you can know what a hacker might do to get to your assets. Okay? This is going to help you determine the criticality of any vulnerability you identified against that asset also. Remember I told you had to start identifying what are you going to fix first? This is going to help you do that. Okay? The asset with the vulnerability may not be of high value to the organization. However, a high value asset may be connected to a vulnerable asset, which would impact how the vulnerability might be managed or how you're going to manage it. So you look at the asset itself and say, okay, it's okay or it's not okay, but what is it connected to? Okay? Identifying and also recording your assets as they connect or disconnect to the network is also key to ensuring a consistent view of all your vulnerabilities that you have. Okay? So those are some of the things I want you to look at on this particular incident. Next slide, please. Also, you have to prioritize, as I told you before. So you want to prioritize those things based on the network-based discovery I have here. What are your known and unknown devices? You have to determine your network-based application, determine your scalability. I won't go through all of them, but look at your agent-based discoveries. That's an in-depth review of the applications and patch levels. You have to look at your network and agent-based discovery techniques, make sure they're optimal. And you have to look at you have to do this on a frequent basis. It could be continuous, daily, weekly. You know, that once a year inventory, you may have put a dozen different things onto your system, and you don't even know it's on there because you do a once a year inventory. Think about an inventory management process that's more frequent than that once a year, if you even do it once a year. Next slide, please. Step 2 is vulnerability identification. Now I know what I have. How can they be effective? Okay? So knowing what vulnerabilities exist for each asset and the criticality of that vulnerability is essential to determine how best you're going to secure it. See, vulnerabilities may exist on every device that you have and every asset that you have due to missing patches, due to old software, due to weak password, poor configurations, whatever it may be. Now, how easy is it to exploit that vulnerability, or what kind of damage could be caused by exploiting that vulnerability is going to be determined by the criticality. And here, when we do this vulnerability identification, this is where we're going to assign those criticalities. Next slide, please. How do we do that? Well, basically, we're going to correlate our threats. We're going to look at the threats view our different potential threats, and we're going to rank them. Next slide. So not all threats and vulnerability have equal priority, as we already stated. The primary goal you all have as security professionals is to make sure that you can rapidly protect your most critical assets should you be attacked. So you have to identify things, various threats like worms, exploits, hacking, APTs, new vulnerabilities, whatever they may be. And then you correlate with your most critical assets, okay, the critical assets versus those vulnerabilities. And then the result is going to be you prioritizing those vulnerabilities in your own particular environment. Next slide. Okay. Step 3 is to have consistent vulnerability management. So a point-in-time vulnerability scan like Nessus or something else is only going to provide you a limited view of the potential security exposure. I think you all know that. You run Nessus scan, it gives you a snapshot of what's happening with your system right now. However, any new vulnerability that's introduced as a result of some newly discovered software bugs, new devices added onto your network, or change the systems are going to end up going undetected until the next scan. And who knows your scan? If you scan it daily, that's good. Or if you scan it monthly, So what's going to happen there? It's going to leave those systems at risk until you discover what those new vulnerabilities are. So less frequent scans can also result in large numbers of vulnerabilities to address after each scan. So I scan this month and scan it again next month. I have to deal with those. I have to deal with what has happened throughout that time, patch them, fix them, configure them, whatever it may be. And then you look at this. In some cases, just having so many of them, the sheer volume of the vulnerabilities discovered can discourage any remediation actions I may take. I mean, I have to fix them, but I'm going to be, when can I fix them? How soon can I fix them? How long is it going to take to fix them? So what you need to do as a security professional is that you have to use consistent, high-frequency scanning techniques in order to enable you or your organization to be able to quickly identify any new vulnerabilities that you have. Okay? By doing this, you're going to be able to reduce the volume of vulnerabilities from any one scan, making it more likely that those issues are going to be addressed by you between the time you do your scan, that scan, and the next scan. Okay? Very important to have consistent vulnerability management. Next slide. Step 4 is risk assessment. Told you everything should be driven by risk, by your risk assessment, I should say. So not all your devices and assets are going to require the same level of security, and I think you understand that. So depending on the value to your organization of the asset and how exposed it is to those vulnerabilities that we already discovered in one of the other steps, it's going to determine what steps you're going to require, you're going to need to protect them. So your risk is often described as the impact an attack is going to have, balanced by the likelihood of occurrence and the complexity of the success of those particular attacks. And that's what we have to figure out. That's our job, to figure this out with our risk assessment. Now, those vulnerabilities are what allow an attacker to find an entrance into your otherwise protected environment. For instance, a weak password might run the risk of being easily guessed and allowing unauthorized access to the system. And, of course, we don't want that to happen. But look at this. It's just a weak password. And you know this is a human issue. It's the passwords that they build. Let's look at what we do, a missing patch. A missing patch on a web server run the risk of an attacker actually exploiting a vulnerability that we may have and gain access to our server, which is even worse probably than that password problem that they had, that our people had by having a weak password. So what I want you to do here in risk assessment is that in order to make an informed risk management decision on the levels of risk that's posed against our particular organizations, we have to have accurate, as I said on the slide here, accurate and timely details on the vulnerabilities that exist. And then we have to employ a consistent vulnerability management approach that provides timely data to support an effective risk management process. All right? I want to move on to step 5. The next most important, I'm not step 5, forgive me. So I wanted to go over a quick formula that I mentioned earlier. In order to determine your risk level, you have to have your assets times your vulnerability, times your threats. And once you're able to figure these out, you're able to find out what your risk level and risk exposure is. And that's one of the first steps. Next slide for risk, please. And then you do that risk calculation that I just spoke about. It's the combination of those vulnerabilities, those assets, and those threats. And then your vulnerability management program is going to be based on an assessment of the criticality that you got from these three things. And then what are you going to do? As a security professional, you're going to focus your resources on the true risk. And I say that because many times we build a program out and we base it on just best practices or things we've seen or things we've done elsewhere. But what are the true risks to the organization? We have to figure that out before we have a true mitigation or remediation strategy for it. Next slide. Step 5, have a good change management process. We know that in our organization, in our systems, changes occur regularly on our networks and on our systems, and on many networks and systems, because we might have multiple ones. We know the software is upgraded, hardware is added or removed throughout the year, applications are constantly updated, and we have to keep up with those things. We have to have a good change management process once again. Each change that we make to our system actually has a potential to introduce new vulnerabilities or new issues that can actually undermine the security of our organization. You know that we put a new process in place or a new patch in place without testing it, we know that it can actually bring down our organization. I wonder how many of you on this in this webinar don't have a dev operation. You know, we have dev, we have ops, and we have tests. Do you have those environments? Are you using those environments? I have actually seen organizations that take a patch and they put the patch right into the system. And then they tell me, well, we don't do it for all patches. We just do it for some patches. You are taking a risk there, and I've seen it bring those systems down. But anyway, we have to have a good change management process. We want to integrate change management with a consistent vulnerability management process, and this is going to help us ensure potential security issues are identified and dealt with as early as possible. Next slide, please. In step 6, I just spoke about patch management. So that's an important aspect of our vulnerability management system as well. An effective vulnerability management program needs to be integrated tightly with our patch management and release management processes that we might have in our organization, and hopefully you have them. And we do this in order to ensure that our software updates are applied to systems and assets in accordance with the criticality to the organization. Not just because I got a new patch, not because I got a new virus system, but because it's going to be linked to the criticality of our organization. So basically, feedback from the patch management program should be given to the vulnerability management program to record which vulnerabilities have been addressed. We have to constantly speak to each other and know what each other are doing. It might be the same folks doing it, but maybe not. Okay. Now that patch management process should also be integrated with the change management process that I spoke about a little while ago to ensure that software updates and releases are applied in a controlled manner. Again, if you don't have a change control board, hopefully you have some process that you can use to make this happen. Now, it's also important to ensure that the vulnerability management process scans systems, scan the system posts, and look at any. Well, I'm sorry, they should scan the system and look at any updates to ensure that the update has been applied properly or posted properly, and that it addresses the identified vulnerability that we're dealing with. Next slide. Step 7 in our process is dealing with mobile devices. Everybody have mobile devices now. I work for a healthcare organization right now, and let me tell you, we locked down everything. The only social media site, I'm digressing just for a second, but the only social media site you can go to is LinkedIn. You can't go to anything else. We do not allow any email except the company email. You cannot open AOL, Gmail, anything at my organization. You cannot put in any USB. You have to have an issued USB with encryption on it, VPNing. You know, you can VPN and things like that. But we have very, very tight controls against anything on the outside, especially mobile devices. You know, we have a strong mobile device management process. We issue certain people phones for doing certain things. Now, you can link your phone in, I believe, to get email. I don't do it, but our processes are very, very strict. So step 7 is for you to have mobile device management. And we know that, as I was just describing, mobile devices are a pervasive part of our IT landscape in any organization, I'm sure. You know, and what happens with this? It brings its own unique security and management risks and challenges for our organization. You know, now One of the problems is that mobile devices evade traditional vulnerability and compliance management methods, and mixed ownership and control models that we have in place. Do we have corporate-owned devices, versus bring your own device? And what does this do? What it does for us is it actually creates policy gaps in our policy as to how we should actually deal with those things. How does it help us deal with a situation if your own BYOD device has been compromised in some way and now it's compromising our assets at work? So what we need to do is we need to integrate mobile device management systems or deploying technologies such as agents and things like that we use. We have to integrate these things in order to enable organizations to add mobile devices to the assets identified and then manage them as part of our vulnerability management system or our vulnerability management program. How do we bring these things together to make them work synergistically, basically? Step 8, next slide. So in step 8, we have mitigation management. So an element often overlooked when people have an effective vulnerability management program, well, I'll say it's not effective until you look at this, but it's often overlooked as part of your program is how to manage vulnerabilities in the event no software update or fix is there to address the vulnerability problem. So what do? There's no patch yet. There's no updates. There's no fix. What do we do? Right? Now, there's always going to be a period of time from when a vulnerability is discovered, as I just said, until a permanent fix to address it is available from the vendor. We know that. Patches don't come, well, patches do come out every day, but it might not be the one we need. So as a result of this, our organization assets might be exposed to compromise until that fix is actually available. So an effective vulnerability management program is going to identify some alternative or workaround ways to manage the exposure, such as changing the firewall rules or increasing the log monitoring or updating our IDS attack signatures or whatever you have in place that can think of based on the problem until the vendor actually provides a fix for the problem. So how do we do that? We have to have that mitigation strategy or mitigation management strategy in place, working hand in hand with our vulnerability management strategy. Next slide. For doing this, as I said, we have to be able to proactively fix our vulnerabilities through our mitigation, remediation principles that we spoke about before. Next slide. Some of the ways to do this is, well, first of all, as I have here, perfection is unrealistic when it comes to zero-day vulnerabilities. It says think about credit card fraud. Will banks ever eliminate credit card fraud? Probably not. Will we ever eliminate problems to our security systems? Probably not, and that's a good thing because it keeps all of us gainfully employed. We only have limited resources in order to address our issues. We are so busy in my organization that there's no downtime almost, and we're doubling our forces right now. So the question becomes do I address this particular problem or not? And remember, again, that's based on your criticality. So you have to factor in the business impact costs. How's it going to impact my business? Plus the remediation costs to fix this thing. It says if the risk outweighs the cost, we're going to eliminate or mitigate the vulnerability. That's what we have to do. If the risk outweighs the cost, we got to fix it. If it doesn't, we might put that on the back burner for just a while. Next slide. We want to apply the Pareto principle. Remember the 80-20 rule? Focus on the vital few things that really is critical to our organization and not those trivial things right away. As I have here, 80% of your risk can be eliminated by addressing 20% of the issues. The risk union will show you the way. The right assets, having the right mitigation strategy at the right time. Next slide. Do we patch or do we mitigate? We have to figure it out. Do we patch or do we mitigate? Again, it's based on the impact of availability from a bad patch versus the risk of not patching. Or is the patch on time? Is the patch going to break something and cause some other damages? Then we might have to wait. At TSA, we used to wait 3 iterations of patches before we made our changes because they had to go through our tests, our dev, and our other environments. At TSA, this was for the watch list, and it could never go down. It had to be up 24/7 or else something bad could happen on a plane. So we had to wait. But what was the risk there? Our risk was that now we're 3 patches behind. So we had to have a workaround or a mitigation strategy for that. Okay? Next slide. Step 9 is have incident response in place. So incident response, the security of your organization's systems is only going to be as effective as how you respond to actual security breach should it occur. And the rapid response to a security incident can greatly either reduce, well, not great either, it's going to reduce the impact of the incident that happens in the organization. So many organizations view incident response as a function that should only be used in the event of a security breach. But if you want to be up to speed, if you want to be modern, the modern threat landscape requires a more proactive approach to responding to known and potential incidents. I keep saying that word proactive. We do the same thing when I was a federal agent. We need to be proactive when it came to crime and not just react when a crime had occurred. So while the discovery of critical vulnerability does not automatically mean a security breach has occurred, ensuring that the incident response process is alerted to the issue can provide a number of different benefits for you. And first of all, it enables you or maybe not you, because you might not be the person who does incident response, but your incident response people would be better prepared in the event an incident happens by being proactive. And it also allows them to make sure that they have the appropriate tools and security monitoring in place in order to respond appropriately when something happens. If you guys recall, the breach that just happened with OPM was discovered because they were hacked last April of last year, and they put some mitigation strategies in place this year that allowed them to proactively see what was happening on their network. Now, still had been on there a few months, but they would not have even been able to see it had they not changed it from the breach last year. Right? And step number 10 is automation. So the final key to you having a successful vulnerability management program is some type of automation. Now, I'm one of those people that say you can't throw technology and tools at a problem, but when it comes to vulnerability management and other type of security security techniques that you use to watch your system, automation is not a bad thing coupled with the human element. So security solutions are often viewed as a means to stop or prevent a security breach. However, in reality, this is often not the case. Depending on who or what the attacking system is, the various security solutions may be simply a speed bump that we have, or merely a delaying technique we use for the attacker from reaching their goal. So therefore, what's key? Step number 2 I have here is key. Time is of the utmost importance in detecting, assessing, and remediating any vulnerability that you may have. Now, another motivation that you have is to automate where possible, because, as I told you, there's a large volume of data that you have to deal with, and you want automation to be able to help you deal with that large volume of data, okay? And it can process it much quicker than we can. Now, this is going to depend on the size and the complexity of your environment, of course, and how you manage it. But many large networks constantly have devices being added, changed, and removed constantly. So having some type of automation process is going to help you. Basically, the manual processing that we do of large amounts of data is going to be extremely time-consuming, number one. And if you look at the people that you have, it's probably going to be prone to some type of error. So the final reason for us to automate is to reduce the human element that I'm talking about from the process, therefore reducing the risk of some type of human error. All right? So it's important to have automation. I think you're going to get a demonstration on that as we go. Next slide, please. So in summary, we talk about the volatility of our threat landscape today and the growing complexity that we have with the computer systems and networks that we have within our organizations. And then we take this and we couple this with the speed of change that we go to every single day. And what this means is that an effective vulnerability management system is a critical element for us to be able to secure networks and systems and application and data and phones and everything else we have. So vulnerability management has to evolve beyond just being a simple exercise that we use where we schedule some vulnerability scans and we take that and we deliver it to our client or to our organization a few times a year. And instead, it's going to need to become a continuing process, proactively identifying potential threats. Again, I'm using that word proactive again. Okay? And then equally important is ensuring that the vulnerability management process is integrated tightly with those other processes that I mentioned earlier, patch management, inventory management, and all those processes in order to complement and enhance each of those different management systems capabilities. So in particular, the ability to detect new assets on the network and to quickly scan them for vulnerability threats is number one critical. It's the most critical. And then due to the volume of data to be processed, automating the different processes and their interdependencies that they have is going to be vital to maintain our security posture for our organization. As I have on the slide here, the hardest step in a 1,000-mile journey is that first step. You have to start somewhere. And these 10 things that I gave you today is a good baseline, a good place for you to start, so you can be able to strategically manage your vulnerabilities in a comprehensive and cohesive and synergistic process with the other management tools that you have in place. Thank you all very much, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah for a moment.
Thank you, Derek. This is Alex DaCosta here at Beyond Trust, product manager of our Retina solution. And what I'd like to do really is just spend about 10 minutes giving you a little glimpse as to what we offer from a vulnerability management perspective here at Beyond Trust. Definitely, obviously don't have the time, but going over those top 10 most effective vulnerability management tips there, we cover those within our solution. Kind of the thing I would like to start with in the demo, though, is sort of the output. And Derek kind of brought this up a few times, is when we scan, really regardless of what solution you use to scan an environment, lots of data comes back, more than anyone can really deal with. So we see this as a challenge in this space. So what I'd like to show you is our analytics and reporting, is what our solution is doing to help you understand what should you go after first and why. In a perfect world, yes, we'd like to remediate everything, but we all know that that's just not going to happen. That's impossible. So I'd like to give you a few sample reports here so you can get an idea of, again, how we help you prioritize, and also over time, look at historical data. Being able to check on yourself, are we actually getting to everything? Are we actually fixing the important things we said to fix? And are we meeting our SLAs? And then we'll wrap it up with some other very cool technology we've added recently called Clarity, to help you find rogue systems, rogue users within your environment based on this information that we're collecting purely doing vulnerability management. So with that here, we have an executive summary. This is my starting point. Gives me a big picture of the environment. It shows me over the last 12 months, how many systems am I finding? How many systems are falling within a high or medium risk? And also how many exclusions we might be making over time. Then I see right now what are the top 10 high or medium risk vulnerabilities, as well as the top 10 systems with the largest number of vulnerabilities. So just kind of a big picture of what's happening right now. Now I can drill down and see more information about any of these values. I'll pick on my number one vulnerability here, this Microsoft XML. 13 systems are affected by it today. I can click on that 13 and actually see by domain, by machine, who has that vulnerability today. And the very last column also gives me an age perspective. How old is this vulnerability? I also have an exploit column. It also maps to whether or not these are vulnerabilities currently exploitable in the wild. What does the vulnerability mean? Simply click on the name. I can see descriptions, fixed informations, and references. Now, granted, I would never run a top 10 executive report to know how I fix something, if that's what I'm after. Of course, I have my remediation reports to do so. My takeaway here is, no matter what kind of report you start with, no matter how high level, if somebody has a question of a value within that screen, you're 1 or 2 clicks away to understanding more information. Now, I'd like to show you is a couple of risk reports, how we help you prioritize. So we're going to do a risk matrix by vulnerabilities, or in essence, a heat map. I'll start by selecting a time period I like to focus on. I can also narrow my scope to what we call smart groups. These are logical groups of assets you guys will build to mimic your environment. These are also groups that you can train the product to understand the criticality of the assets within these groups. So not all systems are equal, not all vulnerabilities are equal. It all depends on the systems that they're in. As Derek was saying, when those systems communicate with other more critical systems, etc., there's going to be a change of risk depending on the vulnerability and the assets. We manage all that through what we call smart groups. Ultimately, though, we have a heat map on the screen. The top right quadrant is where I want to focus. That's my most critical quadrant. Those are number of critical vulnerabilities that I have that I need to go after first. But the value in parentheses narrows my scope even farther. These are the vulnerabilities that are also mapped to exploits. So again, we can't get to everything. So at least let's leverage some of these technology, these mappings, to let us focus our attention on the most critical and already exploitable vulnerabilities in the wild. In my case, I've got 101. I can click on that value. It drills down and provides me a list of those most critical vulnerabilities. And the very last column also gives me a quick how many systems are affected by it. And of course, I can drill down and see more details, or you can always start with a more drill down view if that's what you're after. Derek also pointed out automation. So you can absolutely subscribe to any of these reports you're seeing here today. There's over 300 reports in this solution. Have them, the ones that make sense for you, have them sent to you or the team via email, post it onto a share, select from a number of different formats, and have that report be automatically delivered to the right team so that you can start to take some action. Another example I like to show here is our threat analyzer. Again, we're collecting all this data about your environment. What systems do we really need to go after first? What vulnerabilities are most meaningful if I fix those first? So the threat analyzer will give me a graphical representation of my environment divided by these smart groups. Again, think of them as business units. These smart groups, the bigger they are on the screen, the more at risk that particular environment is, based on profiles you can apply. I might be after critical vulnerabilities that are older than 30 days. Let's see which of these groups are falling behind. Or maybe these are groups that have vulnerabilities associated with malware, right? Most often, malware gets on a system via a vulnerability that's there, so why not start prioritizing by that fact? And again, see which of these groups need your attention. Best thing you can do at this point is actually go into any of those groups and do some risk reduction forecasting. Being able to see how the risk would improve if you fix the top X number of vulnerabilities. Little disclaimer here, this is my lab. I do nothing but collect vulnerabilities and very little remediation is done. So I have to do quite some work here to make some change. But we can see that if I fix the top 20 vulnerabilities in that particular VLAN, I would have an improvement of 7%, vulnerability count just down by 14%, and there are 310 systems that would be affected. Bottom of the screen will give you the list of those top 20 vulnerabilities you want to go after. Now, if I change that top 20, let's do something a little more here, maybe the top 150. I see my asset risk is now 23% better. 70% of the vulnerabilities would be gone. Again, the bottom gives me a list of what gets me there. From that list, I want to point out the mitigation column. And again, tying back to some of the topics Derek was bringing up is, well, some vulnerabilities are 0-day, right? They're known, but the vendor hasn't released a patch. Some are patchable, security updates. The majority of them actually are. And then you have others. Those are configuration-based changes. You got to turn something on or off. Basically, it's not a patch. So these are all important. Now, if I'm going to hand a report to somebody whose job is to just patch, and that report includes 0 days or configuration changes, granted, these are important. They're noise for that particular person whose job is just to apply patches. So you can always, always filter our reports so they make sense for the audience, and there is no noise within that report. Two last examples here I'd like to give you. This one's changing gears a little bit and looking more of a trending perspective. I honestly feel that it's just as important to know today, what do I need to fix today, as well as what has happened over time. Am I actually remediating the vulnerabilities that are coming in, or is more coming in that I can actually get to, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to drop this Delta report. You'll notice as I'm talking, there's quite a few different variables that I can set. Some reports have more, some have less. It all depends on the data points within any of these reports. We're able to manipulate them so, again, they make sense for the audience. All of these trending reports will also showcase themselves graphically as well as numerically. So here we can see since the beginning of last year, that's just the time period I chose, all the way till today, how many vulnerabilities came in, how many were fixed, how many were still there at the end of each month. You can always do this based on your entire enterprise or a particular business unit, or again, as we call it, smart group, or based on many other metrics that are available. The next page is the same data set, but with a couple of other data points. I've got the average age and fixed time by the end of each month. I can see more clearly now the starting count. How many vulnerabilities am I starting with versus fixed that month versus came in new, and ultimately what did I end with. You can go down to as much detail as you like. I'll pick on May of this year. What was fixed? Just click on the value and we will see down to the machine what vulnerability was fixed the month of May. The very last column gives me an average of how long it took from when we found it to when it was remediated. So lots and lots of metrics that you can draw up based on any of these values. And the last one I'd like to show you today is clarity. So as we do all of these vulnerability scans, again, fully automated, have the solution go out there, find vulnerabilities, have the reports generate automatically to help you prioritize and know what to go after. As we collect all of this information, we can have clarity. Actually, I'm going to go one more farther back. We can have clarity analyze if any of these assets have malware. We also can pull the hash of some other running processes and services and actually analyze them to see if they have malware to add more value to the solution. Clarity does cluster mapping behind the scenes to also find anomalies. So as you scan an environment, let's just take here our sales department. All the sales folks here at BeyondTrust, they have the same laptop with the same operating system, with the same applications installed. Scan them over and over again. There's a pattern. I expect Clarity to put all of these systems within the same cluster. This all happens behind the scenes. Now, what happens if one of those machines get compromised or the user starts to deviate from their normal operations? We're going to pick that up. Clarity is going to call out some of my cluster movements, which systems seem to jump around from cluster to cluster, which is a clear indicator that they might be compromised. Or again, do they have any malware associated with it? And also, as you see on this graph on the right-hand side, we can see other values from our other solutions that we have, from our list privilege solution, from our password safe solution. It all integrates into the same management console and can give you a greater understanding of, again, rogue users, rogue machines, potentially infected machines, and helping you prioritize even further as to who you might go after. And as I go into a particular machine, based on vulnerability data, we're looking at outliers. So this particular machine currently being called out by Clarity shows this column of outliers. These are high-risk vulnerabilities. We don't see them anywhere else in my lab. How come? There's usually patterns. How come only this box has these vulnerabilities? What's the user doing different there that we don't see anywhere else? So again, just helping you prioritize and be ahead of the curve and understand what you need to go after. So I will pause there and throw it back to Sarah for the poll.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. Hey, guys, real quick, just based on what Alex showed you from this demo, would you like to receive a free trial of Retina? If you select yes, somebody will be in contact with you with license details so you can get up and running in your environment and play around with it. I'm going to be really cognizant of time. We are approaching the top of the hour. I'm going to leave this quick poll up. We had a couple questions come in. Alex, is Beyond Insight a vulnerability scanner, and does it have patch management capabilities?
Yes and yes. So Beyond Insight is technically our management console for many solutions that we have at BeyondTrust. One of them is our Retina technology, which is the vulnerability scanning technology that plugs into Beyond Insight. Beyond Insight also offers a patch management module, which integrates behind the scenes. It integrates with Microsoft WSUS or SCCM, and it basically allows you to leverage that technology and enhances it to do third-party patching as well.
Alex, what about SIEM? Is there an integration for Splunk, QRadar, et cetera?
Yes. So we've got lots of third-party integration out of this solution for your SIEMs, QRadar, Splunk. Yes, absolutely. We have out-of-the-box integration with those solutions, as well as ticketing systems, NAC solutions, etc. We also have integrations with those.
All right, fantastic. And we had a couple of other questions that came in asking about if the recording is going to be available. Yes, you will be receiving a link. It will actually be an email, and it will have a link to the recording and to the PowerPoint presentation in it. It will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. You should probably receive that in the next couple of business days, so definitely be on the lookout for that so you can refer back to anything that Derek or Alex talked about or covered in this session, and you can also share it with any colleagues or somebody that you think would benefit from the session as well who wasn't able to attend.